Us tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I am Atira Winchester. No sound. Any better? Yeah. Okay, I'll start again. Wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Very warm welcome to you. For those who don't know me, I'm the Director of Content and Leadership at NAF. My name is Atira Winchester. Okay, I'll shout louder into the microphone. Any better? Okay. So what I want to say is that we are very aware that this is the eve of one of the most difficult days since October the 7th. We have news that 4 of the fallen hostages we returned in the morning. This is a very difficult time across the Jewish world and, of course, in Israel. And our hearts and our thoughts are very much with the hostage families. We're keenly sensitive to that reality. There's many people here in the room tonight who are veteran supporters of NAF, but equally there are people for whom this is your first NAF event. And I want everybody to know that despite the turbulent times that we live in, our values and vision remains the same. We are committed to a just, safe, and equal Israel. And that doesn't change. Chairing our conversation tonight is Dr. Ayala Paniewski. Ayala is at Cambridge, but also at City, an expert in populism and in media. But she's also one of us, as in a fellow at Molad for the Center for Renewal of Israeli Democracy. And with great pleasure, I hand over to you.
Thanks a lot, Atira. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. So thanks everyone for being here. And I'm very excited and honored to present to you our speakers tonight. Miki Gitin, who is the Israel CEO of the New Israel Fund, and Daniel Sokach, who is the global CEO of the New Israel Fund, 2 of the people who are really dedicating their lives to create a different future for Israel, to create sustainable peace for Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East, and to support the democratic institutions within Israel in these very difficult times. I would start by saying I think it would be a wild guess to assume this was perhaps the worst year in the lives of many of us here in this room. It was 500 days, really, of pain and loss and anxieties and tears. And this hasn't ended yet because the next episodes of this horror show keep coming. We know that tomorrow, apart from the Bibas family, which is expected to be back in Israel in coffins, Oded Lifshitz, the father of Sharon Lifshitz, will also be back. I know that many of us here know Sharon. Sharon is part of our community here in the UK. She was part of the struggles over these past years for a different future in Israel. So I know we all mourn and we're all in pain. And as we speak, nothing ended and people keep getting hurt. And death and destruction is everywhere. But I don't want it to be a depressing evening, because I think one of the important things we can be in these moments is together. And we need our close friends and strong alliances more than ever. So I am very happy to spend this evening with you. And I wanted to start by saying that apart from this terrible loss and pain, this year and a half was also very challenging for our solidarities, for our alliances, for our communities, for understanding who is with us in this fight and who isn't. And I think one of the things that happened this year to many of us is that we started questioning many things that we took for granted for many years about our values and our presumptions and our intuitions. And because solidarity and alliances are the infrastructure of our activism, really, and the way that we can bring about change. This was particularly challenging. And I wanted to start off by asking you, Miki and Daniel, if you could tell us a bit about how this year changed you two personally and how it affected and shaped your incredible and important work with the New Israel Fund.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Ayala and Daniel. I'm extremely proud and pleased to be here in this room with this community. As Ayala said, this is a very difficult evening. I mean, the BOS family was a symbol, the pictures of the kids and Shiri and the short film of their kid. It was just horrific. And Oded Lifshitz was basically part of our community of peace and shared society, anti-occupation activism for all of his life. And what has changed past October 7th? Everything and nothing at the same time in many ways. I think that I will not say something that will be too big to say. I think in many ways the promise of Israel, the actual very basic promise of the state of Israel was shattered on October 7th. My parents are immigrants to the state of Israel. They came in the late 70s. And there is one notion that the state of Israel has promised all of us is not a life with no wars, not peace, but certain level of security. And what we found out on October 7th that was really the most difficult for me is how dysfunctional was the entire system. It was dysfunctional on October 7th itself. But for me personally, that was the hardest point when I found myself on October 8th or 9th or 10th, literally calling hotels, trying to get rooms for people who needed, that had to be evacuated because there was no one else other than philanthropy and civil society to put people. There was a dysfunctioning system that was not working. We as organizations came way earlier into the state. And I've been leading NIF for a long time, and my criticism of the politics of this government was very, very clear earlier. But that was kind of like breaking the heart. Like that shattered me because we thought that at least when reality hits, there is going to be there, someone is going to be there, and no one was there. Literally, no one was there other than very, very good people and very, very good community of supporters from around the world. And that, I think, was the most kind of like difficult point in which, for me at least, to understand that there is no one to look up to. But it's not with no reason. Populism, corruption, leadership as we have now in Israel must crack down institutions and system in order to keep controlling. And that's what has happened. The state, the mechanism of the state was taken down by those who tried to keep controlling the state of Israel. And that's something very deep. And you read about it when you read about populism, and you read about it when you read about autocracy. But I think that when it came to this kind of understanding, again, think about it. A person from the Welfare Ministry of Israel calling a grants officer of the New Israel Fund, after everything that has been between the government of Israel and the New Israel Fund, can you please pay for rooms in Eilat? That was, for me, in many ways, the place that I understood that something is really very deeply broken.
how would you say, changed the way you do your work at the NIF?
First of all, I think that one of the things that have changed at NIF is that we are much more clear about our priorities. We know we can't do everything. We understood very early on, because of that, people were talking about the day after. When we created an emergency plan for NIF, the notion of how do you work on the day after, how should look an alternative government, how you actually need to start thinking about security, peace, agreements. It started on October 8th, basically. So we're much more of a strategic funder and organizer and convener of the field. We know that we can't do anymore so many of the beautiful, good things that we used to do, supporting the wonderful organization that do, that is still civil society. We need to be much more focused. And we realized the day it happened, that the day after is already there. And I think that kind of shaped the current strategy of NIF more than anything else.
Great, so we will get to the long-term strategy later on, but I do want to hear from you, Daniel, as well about this past year on a more personal note.
Thanks, Ayala, and hello to everybody. We're so happy that you're with us tonight. Forgive us, Mickey came from Tel Aviv and I from San Francisco, so we immediately got sore throats when we got to London, which is why we sound as we do. When you asked that question, it immediately occurred to me that the past year and a half or 16 months, in a way, is not the time frame that I sort of experience what I think of as the current cycle of earthquakes. And for me, in some ways, it begins in January of 2023, and perhaps even before that, because I think that for no one in this room or on this stage, but for a lot of people, October 7th is the minute where they begin to tune in and to form opinions and to form uninformed opinions. But of course, what we know is that the challenges in Israel sort of that contributed to the chaos and catastrophe of October 7th in the ways that you just described, Mickey, began far before that. So for me, I think about the beginning of what we call the judicial overhaul or the democracy backsliding. And those of you who have been long-time NIF supporters, I was just talking to a former NIF staffer who was remembering 16 years ago when we talked in our Jerusalem office about the attacks on civil society, on New Israel Fund, on what we said then, in the words of our former board chair, Nomi Chazan, Deputy Speaker of the Knesset, she called it a democratic recession, and we were told we were hysterical and hyperbolical and chicken littles, right? Saying the sky was falling. And now, then in February of 23, Mickey and I were walking through the streets of Tel Aviv with hundreds of thousands of people and seeing some of those critics on the barricades chanting democracy. So the moment of crisis, I think, had already begun. And into that crisis, of course, comes the catastrophe. And so if the first point is that for me, the time frame seems bigger. And to be honest, in a sense, while for many people who were watching the judicial overhaul, the judicial coup, that was a moment where they began to question, what is Israel? What is this place that I thought I knew? For New Israel Fund, it was the moment where we thought the cavalry is arriving, right? And an interesting thing happened, a similar thing happened after October 7th, which I'll come to in a second. But I also want to answer honestly your question and talk about what it felt like. And so the second point I want to make, and I suspect those of you who are not Israeli, who are British or from other diasporic communities will be quite familiar with what I'll try to describe. In the week that followed October 7th, I realized this was happening after the fourth interview, and it was the second one with the same newspaper, the New York Times, where I was asked by reporters, did I feel betrayed by the response of the American progressive social justice left, given the lack of concern in so many of those quarters for what had happened to Israelis, the accusations that Israel was going to committing war crimes or genocide on October 8th. Right, before any evidence could be proffered or Israel had done anything yet. And the truth is, while I think that to a certain extent that story got more oxygen than it deserved, given the actual catastrophe unfolding on the ground? I certainly understood it, and frankly, the answer was yes. And so that's the second on a personal level. And I want to be very clear, right? In the ranks of the Democratic Party in the United States, in the ranks of the civil rights movement, people are as you would expect them to be. They were humane, they were sympathetic, they were concerned. But in some of the more sort of what I now think of as more extreme sectors of the social justice movement or the movement for racial justice, there was a shocking betrayal. And the betrayal, as I experienced it, was this. I've always known that plenty of people out there on the left, I'll only speak about the American left, you have your own challenges here. I would argue, I have observed that they're perhaps even more challenging than what we've experienced. But on the American left, my assumption was, look, there are a lot of people who don't like Israel, right? Fair, I get it. But my assumption was that those people were human rights people. Now, many people in this room are NIF supporters or stakeholders for a long time, and many of you have experienced in your own lives, as the three of us have, no doubt, criticism for people because we are concerned with the human rights and civil rights of people who are not Jewish in Israel. Because we are concerned with the work to build a truly shared society. Because we are concerned about the occupation and settlement enterprise and what that means morally and strategically for Israeli democracy and for the people Israel is controlling. And we have often paid a price for that. One of the people I was speaking with tonight earlier said she felt that behind her computer, she was at the barricades when she worked for NIF in Jerusalem. And many of us felt that way. And I think what was very hard and very upsetting was to realize that those people that I'm talking about were not human rights people, right? Because a human rights activist says it doesn't matter who the person is whose rights are violated, and it doesn't matter who's violated them, period, full stop. Now that's how NIF does our work. That's why we do what we do in terms of the occupation. And human rights organizations, which, as you're going to ask us in a few minutes, are right now being threatened with being shuttered because of that activism. And I think for many of us in the States, and I imagine for many of you, there was a sense of deep betrayal that people who professed to have universal values didn't when it came to us. But the third and final sort of personal reflection I want to make is that, as I said, sometimes that story got, although true, more air than it deserved. I was in the fascinating position of having two college-age daughters in the period since October 7th on a very liberal American Southern California campus. And their experience there was not the one that everybody read about in every Jewish publication that existed. Yes, there were some incidents that made them uncomfortable. At one point, lighting a Chanukiah in public, a kid opened her dorm room window and shouted, "Free Palestine." And when my daughter called to tell me about it, she said, "Dad, I believe in free Palestine, but I also believe that yelling it at Jewish kids who are lighting a Chanukiah is anti-Semitic." At the same time, when she finally talked to some of these students, she learned what you all suspect, which is that they had no idea about the intricacies or details. And when they engage in conversation, they would say things like, well, I just think everyone should be equal, or I guess there should be a state for the Israelis and a state for the Palestinians. And so I think that what was buoying was to see that that many good people, once they sort of got over the shock of October 7th and then the aftermath of October 7th, arrived at the place where we would hope they arrived. And I guess this is the final piece of good news. That was reflected in support for New Israel Fund in the States, here in the UK, around the world, and in Israel, where 1 in 5 of our donors are Israelis. And we have had, this is a cold comfort, I'll grant you, but it's also, I think, important. We have had the strongest years in our history in terms of global support for the work we do. And so we have been able to invest the most funding that we have ever done in the history of the organization in interventions trying to repair what's been broken.
That's wonderful to hear. Good news. Where do you get good news nowadays, right? I think we're all very thankful to hear that. And I would like you to explain to us a little bit. I don't know how many in this room are aware that there is a new law in Israel that is trying to further restrict NGOs and civil society. don't worry, only the ones that are not funded by the government. They made sure to do this distinction to make sure that their friends are fine. There is a new threat to civil society, which, as Daniel mentioned, has been under threat for many years. And it's not just online. People have had to pay prices and there is violence in the streets. And even my mom, my 70-something-year-old mom, who hasn't missed one protest this year and a half, got her fair share. So while activists on the ground, Israelis and obviously Palestinians, who are always treated worse in this region, are suffering already from a very heavy-handed government. What is this new initiative that we now see? What's the plan? Will it affect the new Israel Fund right after you told us this great news? And is there anything that the UK community can do to support you at this time?
Yeah, so I'll start with your last question. At this moment in time, this legislation that has just passed the preliminary hearing, where we have a way to go and we really hope we'll stop it, will not affect the New Israel Fund, because one of the things that they're trying to do is to affect money that comes from friendly governments that support human rights, shared society, environmental causes, women's rights, LGBTQ rights. And we are lucky enough to have private donors, like many of the organizations on the right. But we are not the story, right? We stand for vibrant civil society in Israel. And the legislation led by Ariel Kellner was trying to do is basically to tax in a level of 80% every funding that comes from a friendly government. And for these organizations, that more than 50% of their funding comes from friendly governments, they'll not be able even to appeal to the Supreme Court. So they're basically cutting their ability to do their work. And why it's so horrific to think about it? First of all, you know, it's needed to say, but vibrant civil society is the only way to keep democracy alive. And when the government trying to basically kill organizations that do not support it basically kills public discourse. One, the organizations. Two, the chilling effect that it creates is enormous. People are not willing to be involved in any activism because they'll pay a price. They use the police, they use legislation. We do believe that we have enough partners and friends and organizational power to fight it. We'll fight it in the Knesset. We'll fight it internationally, because we do not think that it makes sense for the EU or the UK or other countries to fund heavily Israeli universities, Holocaust survivors organizations, right-wing organizations sometimes as well, which will be fine, and then the human rights sector will be the one that suffers from it. So we'll fight it, and if it passes, we'll take it to court, and we hope we'll win it there. But we also know that we need to rearrange the way we do our work. We need to think differently about some of the things that we do. Because to live, the one thing all research shows that differs Israel from Hungary, from Poland some stages, is the level of activism and vibrant civil society that we have in this country. All the negative implications that you could have imagined that were stopped in Israel, at least in the last few years, it was thanks to civil society. They either took the issue to the streets, or took it to court, or brought it to the attention of the public. And I think that that's a struggle on the actual character and the ability of Israeli democracy to work. I'll add another sentence. This is the famous legislation that is passed today, but there is another legislation that is passed preliminary hearing today in Israel. And that legislation is about every source of information, including journalism, that will contribute directly or indirectly to the work of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, will be criminalized by the State of Israel, and you'll be able to arrest the person who did it for doing so. So think about that. A journalist that writes a story about horrific reality in the West Bank. That's their job, to expose horrific stories about what Israel is doing, because that's the very basic notion of human rights organizations, of media, you name it. They could be charged with the criminally by the State of Israel. And that's a different ballgame completely. It's not only organizations, it's not only the structured civil society. Actually, every Israeli individual is under attack for speaking up.
I want to just add a couple of points to that to provide a little more context. First, this is not the first time we have seen this movie before when it comes to the NGO bill. It's been proposed several times. The first time it was proposed, the idea was it would be a 20% tax on a donation from a foreign governmental entity. Then Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked, who in the topsy-turvy world of Israeli politics is no longer seen as the radical extremist that she is, actually in an early draft of one version of the law, demanded that representatives of NGOs working on these issues wear a badge on their clothing to identify them. And even in today's Israel, that did not go over very well. So we've seen this before. Now it's back much more ferociously, as Mickey says, with an 80% tax on, again, from such enemies of Israel as the United Kingdom and the EU and the Swiss. But I want to also note that, and here's where it's not going to feel good for a minute, or maybe for a few minutes. The reason those attempts were defeated in the past, there were many, and certainly you're going to hear from us, and I think you know that the great gift, I think, that Israel has given to the world, and what we're most proud of helping to give to Israel, is this powerful civil society that took to the streets and checked some of the worst outrages of the judicial overhaul. And make no mistake, this is just the latest round of that judicial overhaul. That was one incredibly important factor, but there was another incredibly important factor, and that was international opprobrium. That was international pushback from Israel's best friends in the world, who said, you just can't do that and be part of the democratic and liberal family of nations. And ultimately, the combination of those two things did stop the worst of these excesses. But that's not the world that we live in now. It's the world that you all live in right now, but it's not the world that Mickey and I live in. And I didn't say this in the personal reflections part of my answer to your question, but I will say, for me and for tens of millions of Americans like me, this has been an absolutely catastrophic 5 weeks. Even if we anticipated it, I've never been so grateful for the system of federalism or to live in California, but it really does feel, in the words of one of our board members, Aaron David Miller, a peace negotiator for Presidents Bush and Clinton, who said, when we asked him to speak to our board in Tel Aviv just next week, he said, of course I'll speak, but it's hard to work up passion even about the destruction of Israeli democracy when the republic is on fire. So it feels to us that the republic is on fire. And of course, that is not something that will affect only Americans or America. And one early warning sign of this is that these two bills are actually very similar to two moves that were made by the Republicans and the Trump administration in the United States over the last couple of months. At the end of last year, House Resolution 9495 was put forward. And H.R. 9495, which didn't pass because the Democrats still control the Senate, but we don't anymore, and they will be back. This will be back soon in the current Congress. H.R. 9495 would have given to the Secretary of the Treasury, that's like the finance minister or chancellor of the exchequer in the United States, full unilateral power to strip a tax-exempt nonprofit organization of its tax-exempt status. That if he finds that that they have done something to, quote, support terrorism, unquote, you can fill in the blank of what that would mean. Now, the genesis of this bill was organizations that were funding the Palestinian protest movement on college campuses, interestingly enough. So it swings back to our part of the world. But of course, any American who thinks that a law like that wouldn't be weaponized to come after reproductive rights organizations or LGBTQ organizations or organizations that support Israeli human rights organizations, I believe are being very, very naive. So HR 9495 is kind of the American version of the NGO bill, but it also, of course, signals that the protection that came from the United States government during the Biden and Obama administrations and the kind of, I think of it as malignant neglect from the first Trump administration is gone now. And now there's a full-throated support for this democratic backsliding in Israel, and they know it. And that's why I think we should take this bill very, very seriously. And Mickey mentioned the ICC bill in Israel. Well, President Trump made an executive order a week and a half ago ordering, I'll just remind us that neither Israel nor the United States is a signatory to the Treaty of Rome that established the ICC. There are no current American officials being targeted by the ICC, but of course, former Defense Minister Gallant and Prime Minister Netanyahu have been issued arrest warrants by the ICC, an interesting and sort of novel legal theory, since Israel's not a signatory to the treaty. So why do they have jurisdiction? The ICC argues, well, Gaza is part of Palestine, which is recognized by the United Nations as a state, and which did join the Treaty of Rome. And so since the crimes they're accused of took place there, they say they have jurisdiction. Close parentheses. As a former lawyer, that's always interesting to me. But the Trump order is very similar to the Israeli order, although less specific. But it does criminalize, it would criminalize support, not make it a civil offense, but criminalize support for anyone who aids and abets or supports the ICC in its prosecution of American or Israeli officials.
So, as you gathered, the part of the good news ended, and we're back in bad news. But as you mentioned, Daniel, we have a new administration in the U.S. We have a new-ish administration here in the UK. Unfortunately, we don't have a new administration back in Israel. But how do you see the role of civil society in such a shifting, insane global landscape that is absorbed in authoritarianism and chaos? And I don't know how many of you had a time to hear Donald Trump calling Zelensky a dictator earlier today, but this is the world we live in right now. How does it affect your work, and how do we keep fighting, and how do we remain effective in such a ever-shifting world?
Well, I'm going to let Mickey sort of talk about our strategies on the ground in Israel, but I do want to say, one of the things that's been worrying to me as an American is watching the absence of what we saw 8 years ago when the streets were filled with millions of people, and all of the research, as Mickey mentioned a moment ago, about democratic backsliding and authoritarian breakthrough attempts suggests that one of the first things that you must do is get right out there on the streets. So I'm now beginning to become encouraged that the Democratic Party has seemed to find its voice. Attorneys generals from many blue states have checked at the courts a number of these excesses. In fact, Trump has only won one court battle thus far. The real big question will come when it comes to constitutional crisis, something that we've been saying in Israel for a long time. What happens when the executive branch receives a direct order not to do something from the judiciary and says, how many tanks do you have? So we're not there in either country yet, but it feels to many of us like we're close. And I think part of the inspiration that we can draw in America, that we have to draw in the States, and one day you may have to draw from, is what you guys have done on the streets of Israel.
Yeah, so I think that first of all, what we've done on the streets of Israel is just incredible. And we should take a moment and appreciate it, right? The fact that Israelis did not watch their country going down the drain and just looked at it and said, that's okay, it's a lot. But at the same time, we need to focus. We need to think what's the most important thing to be fighting over, and how we can actually convince more and more Israelis that there is another way and we can actually have a better life. following this way. And I think that will not happen if we're just going to try to get, to the median voter or to the person that sits there and feels good about himself. I think that one of the ways to do it is actually to speak truth to power, to pay prices, to think for the long term, and to achieve at the end of the day an alternative reality through that. So civil society can't do everything, but what can we do? First of all, one of the things I've learned is there is no strategy that we can give up on. So we should use every strategy we know how to use. And NIF supports at the moment. Community organizing, demonstrations, legal work, political work, building alternatives and ideas and visions for this place that will be much more familiar and clear to people in the Israeli society. Not only working on issues, but building the infrastructure for the pro-democracy movement. What are the ideas of the movement? How do you mobilize people? How do you create networks of people that actually can influence? And how do you work with leaders? And I think that all of these spaces are spaces that civil society actually has the capacity to influence in a positive way. There's so many things we can do, right? And one of the mistakes that sometimes civil society organizations or boards or donors think that civil society can actually touch upon everything going on in the world. We can't. We're talking about Zelensky and Trump and their clash, or call it as you want. Probably we can do very little about that, but we can definitely try to influence the public in which we work, and we can definitely build an alternative to the current reality while working really, really hard to block the negative realities on the ground. And it's, again, for democracy in the West Bank and the occupation and the violence reality in which Palestinians are living under. And it's, of course, has to do with legislation, as we just heard about.
I just want to say that, lest we lose hope, as you were talking, Mickey, I was thinking about something we've all spoken about before, which is that the settlement movement, right? The national religious settler movement in Israel, the MAGA, Make America Great Again movement in the United States, UKIP here. These are small groups of people. They are not majorities. They are small groups of people. What they are is extraordinarily dedicated, tireless. They're marathon runners, and they're totally focused. And we sometimes make a mistake. We think, well, the going has got tough. It's gotten, we've had some losses, and it's time to pack up. Or we think, well, we tried that. We have that idea, and it didn't immediately. Do you think that Gush Emunim in the early 70s could have contemplated that 500,000 settlers would live in the West Bank and another 250,000 in East Jerusalem, the conquered territories of East Jerusalem and the West Bank? Well, you know what? The answer is yes. Yes, they could. Bezalel Smotrich said a couple of years ago, I want 2 times as many settlers in the West Bank. So they were totally focused, and we should, in a sense, I guess, respect that focus, but we should learn from it. The temptation now is to feel like, oh, all hope is lost. There's this bill and the ICC and Bibi and this and now it's Trump. But the truth is, the folks who have created the reality we live in now are not a majority of either of our countries, of any of our countries. And what they've had is the wherewithal and the grit to get past the tough times and the setbacks. I mean, how do you think they felt about the time of Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or Tony Blair or Ehud Barak, or Yitzhak Rabin? So we need to really learn from their grit and not give up and give in to despair because it's really, really shitty right now. Sorry if you're recording that.
So I couldn't agree more, and I think Mickey, because you spoke a little bit about public opinion, and I am a researcher of media. I can't resist the urge to ask you a little bit about how our changing information environment played out in all these concerning trends. I can tell you all that as an Israeli here in the UK, this was a very strange year, And I really felt like at some point my brain was on a split screen mode. And I am sure many of you who have family and friends in Israel felt like that at some points, where people are living in entirely different universes on the very basic facts, the very basic visuals we see. And I was so intrigued when I felt like my community here and my community back home is so distant from each other. I didn't know how to reconcile it. There was not a single word I could say that both would accept, that I set out to conduct some research about it. And I actually looked into the media coverage of the war in Israel and what Israelis were seeing during the first 6 months of the war. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear that it was a very different picture from the one that we saw right here. And the reason I'm saying this is not just because I'm angry. As a former journalist, I used to work for Haaretz for many years. I am angry with what I see as a poor service that the Israeli media has done for the Israeli people, and certainly the Palestinians. But also because I think we have a role here. The people in this room who care for Israel, who are part of the NFI community, but are also distanced enough to see a broader picture than the one our Israeli friends are seeing. And I think there is something to say about our role in this very strange reality that got weirder and weirder over time. I'll give you just 2 funny anecdotes from this past year. The one is not that funny because it's from October 7th, but on October 7th, I was invited to give an interview on LBC. And I was, of course, glued to the television, frantically calling my friends, seeing who is alive, who is injured. And the interviewer here asked me, so what do you think about all these rockets? There are so many rockets today coming from Gaza. And I was surprised. I was like, who cares about the rockets? People are being burnt down in their own homes. So it was one moment that felt odd, and I felt this distance between the UK and Israel. And the interview ended with a question, what do you think? Do you think it is the end of the two-state solution? And I thought, don't you think it's the end of the one-state solution? I mean, it was very clear that the priorities and agendas of people here and back home were very different at this specific moment. And there are a few other moments like that during this past year that made me think that we might actually have an important role bridging this gap and somehow making people here understand better our community in Israel and open the eyes of Israelis to what they are not being shown in the Hebrew-speaking media that they consume. And I wanted to turn and ask you, Daniel and Miki, about a specific group that is often neglected. We talk a lot about Israel and Palestine, and there were many events during this past year. And there is a group that is often overlooked in these conversations about the potential future peace and security. And this is the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Arab community in Israel. And they were actually also trapped this year in a very, very difficult position. I had a friend, it's the last anecdote, I promise. I had a friend visiting here a couple of weeks ago, and she is a Palestinian Bedouin from the Negev. And she came here, she tries to pursue her studies here, and I asked her how she was. And she said, I no longer know what to do. Her community was hit very hard by the rockets coming from Gaza because they live in the south, so they are very close to the border. That was the one thing. The second thing was that they don't have the shelters that many Jewish communities have because the state doesn't recognize their villages. The third part was that because it's a conservative community, Bedouin community in the Negev, they don't reach out to seek help or mental health support, and everyone is wandering around traumatized. And when people were hit and injured in her community, what they saw on social media from their compatriots, from Jewish Israelis, were comments like, "Oh, good, it's an Arab village, we're good." And that was the most painful thing of all. After all this, she came to the UK, and she was asked where she was from. So she said Israel, and she said, and they looked at me as if I'm a war criminal. So really, this community is trapped in an impossible position between many rocks and many hard places. And I know that the NIF is doing so much work with this community, so I would love to hear from you a little bit about your plans and how you manage to support them.
So when you work on equality in Israel, it's clear that there are many communities in Israel, but the real tectonic issue when it comes to Israeli society is the relationship between Jews and Palestinians within Israel as well. And first of all, just as an NIF factor, NIF gives at least 20% of all its resources to the Palestinian community in Israel. It has offices in the Negev to work with the Bedouin community, and in Haifa, in the north, to work with the Palestinian community in the north. It is, and we have at least 20% of our board and staff also Palestinians, but we also the home or the engine of Palestinian civil society, and we've always been. And why is it so important? Because first of all, you described the Negev very well now, and we have a special program that actually is focused on the Negev, because one of the things that we saw post-October 7th is that the relationship between Jews and Arabs in the Negev were, unfortunately, one of the first to shatter, to get to the lowest point, despite the fact that Bedouins in the Negev were affected by October 7th. Despite the fact that our board member, Dr. Yasmin Abu Frecha, a Bedouin physician from the Negev, was there in the ER all day on October 7th, taking care of people who were hurt in this terror attack. So one of the first priority that we made is how do we rebuild or keep the relationship between Jews and Arabs within the Negev? The second thing, and that needs to be said very clear, this government is taking advantage of October 7th to crack down completely the freedom of expression of Arab Israeli citizens or Palestinian citizens of Israel. People were arrested for a post on Facebook. Universities were required to kick out students if they didn't like their opinions. Nothing to do with supporting terror, forget about it. Just for expressing any kind of sympathy to their families in Gaza or the West Bank. And someone had to protect these people, to send lawyers, to call them up and say, are you okay? And those were the organizations and the people we support. And the last thing that we've realized is that in the last few years, because of the political situation in Israel, there is a constant decline in the power and work of civil society within the Arab Palestinian community in Israel. So we built a full program, which is called Nasij, which is embroidery, because it brings everyone together, that actually its goal is to rebuild and strengthen Arab Palestinian civil society in 3 layers. I'm not going to go into the details. But we really, really engage into bringing back those voices, their involvement in Israeli society, so they feel protected, so they feel heard, and they actually have more power to impact the future of Israel. Because I want to make it very clear. The future of the state of Israel depends on the relationship of Jews and Arabs living within Israel. The power of the liberal democratic camp in Israel depends on the political involvement of Arab citizens of Israel. We're talking about a relationship that is the core issue when it comes to Israeli democracy. And I think that we are very proud that's a space that we are respected in, have impact in, and we know, and we have a plan, which is really important. So I think that this kind of like emotional moment that you just described is much deeper than a story of one person or one family or one community. But when it comes to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, it becomes much harder to live with it daily. Yeah.
So I hope, as supporters of the NIF, you're all proud of what your support is doing on the ground. And I want to ask you too about your plan for 2025. Do you think this is going to be an election year? What's your plan for the next elections in Israel, if any? And let's talk future. What's next?
Well, anyone who thinks they can predict whether they know an election's going to come in 2025 is you shouldn't believe them. Maybe the next election is scheduled in 2026, in late 2026. But of course, it could be that we go to early elections. It's been many decades since an Israeli coalition served full 4-year term. On the other hand, these are unique times, and the very small majority that they have actually probably strengthens them. I'll also point out, apropos Mickey's answer to the last question, the only time when the current constellation of ruling coalition parties was unseated briefly for a year and a half was when, for the first time in Israeli history, Zionist parties, Jewish parties, got over the anathema of working together in government with a Palestinian-Israeli party. So I just want to really underscore Mickey's point. There is no democratic liberal future for Israel that is not a shared democratic liberal future for Israel. And if they act together, they are a majority. In terms of 2025, look, as we've discussed already, this is going to be a very tough year. The ascent of the Trump administration is really going to cause a lot of trouble for all of us who are trying to safeguard Israeli democracy. And so we're going to have to, the British government is very supportive. Hopefully other EU governments will be, but we are going to have to take on ourselves, right? Once again, sort of the burden of being the primary pushback. New Israel Fund is a nonpartisan organization. We're forbidden by American, British, Israeli, and all the other laws and places where we operate from engaging in electoral politics. But that doesn't mean we can't support efforts to build progressive democratic infrastructure, as Mickey said, to build, and by that I mean literally the infrastructure of liberal democratic civil society, right? People's voices, people's organizations that can push back. But we're also permitted in doing that to help build the infrastructure of what we call in the US GOTV efforts, get out the vote efforts. You can't do it based on a party. You can't do it even based on a single demographic, but you can do it broadly. And so there we will support organizations that are working in marginalized and minority communities in Israel to really increase people's own sense of their power, of their agency. And I think that in many ways this has been the understandably enormous lift, because for many people sitting in this theater, I'm sure you have thought to yourselves, why in the world doesn't the Arab Israeli, the Palestinian citizens of Israeli community get out and vote? When they voted in force in 2015, they elected the third largest party in the Knesset, 15 seats under the leadership of Ayman Odeh for the Joint Arab List. The reasons why that doesn't get repeated as much as any of us would like to see are manyfold, and one of them is that an enormous effort is put into, as Mickey sort of alluded to, by the powers that be in Israel to demoralizing that community, sometimes literally trying to build structures that forbid or that make it very difficult for Arab parties to make the threshold, as Mr. Netanyahu and now opposition member Mr. Lieberman did some years ago, or recent legislation that once again attempts to keep Arabs out of the Knesset. But if we can help Arab Israeli civil society find its voice and take its agency, that could be a game changer.
Okay, so I have many more questions, but I can always call you guys. So I will now open the floor for questions. If anyone has something to ask, you can think for a moment. And in the meantime, I will just ask you one last question, which is, what do you think the role of the UK community is in this future that you just described?
Well, I mean, I'll say very quickly, the New Israel Fund, right, was by design a partnership between Israelis like you two, who are working to change your country and to embody and operationalize the values and visions we share, and us, right? Folks who are shoulder to shoulder with you. And when I mentioned at the beginning of the evening that we have had our most powerful years of fundraising during these darkest of times, that is because of you, right? That is because of the NIF community in London, in New York, in San Francisco, in Tel Aviv, in Toronto. And so it's not just a blandishment to say we're a partnership, we have to do it together. We literally will not be able to do the kind of work that we do, the big, heavy lifts we're taking right now, without this partnership of us together. So it is the essence of what New Israel Fund does in the world.
I'll just add a sentence. Many times I meet British Jews or American Jews, they tell me, yes, this is very important, but we are not citizens of the country. Maybe it's not our role to speak up and say what we think. And I want to say only one thing about it. The right wing in Israel or internationally has never thought so. The reality in Israel today is created by partnership between radical evangelical Christians that want to see Israel burning, basically. Extreme right-wing American Jews or international Jews and Israelis go to every settlement, see the signs on the wall, and how many of these signs actually are saying that this place was donated by, you name it. So if they can do it, and they do it very powerfully, we need to do at least as much as they do, because they also enjoy government money. So we can't do it without each other, but also we need to look at the right wing and how they work through the years, because otherwise it will not work for us.
Any questions? Yes. Okay.
Thank you. I think we are all here supporters of NIF, so that comes from a good place. So I started by, is that working? Okay, so I said we are all, I guess, supporters of the NIF. So
I'll repeat the question when he's done. I'm not sure the mic is working.
So what I'm going to say, you have to hear it in that spirit. But I still don't hear, firstly, self-reflection on what you've done wrong over many years. I don't hear any bold, different approach. And I'll give a hint, maybe that behind the betrayal you felt, that has to do with identity politics. And maybe you should rethink that, because I think you're absolutely right. The future of Israel is with the Israeli Palestinians, I'll call them, because that's how they want to be called, but also with the people that what we call unnicely Bibistim, and with the people that vote for Shas, and how we get to these people, because they are also, and I'm completely secular, but I think they are also the future of Israel. Thank you.
So I'll try to paraphrase, and you tell me if I've got it wrong. I'm going to try to be very quick, though. This question comes from a place of love. These are NIF supporters, so don't take offense. And believe me, that was a lovely question. We didn't take any offense. Where is NIF self-reflection on where we have fallen short in terms of our strategies and the application of our resources? And given all the things that we've said about the way the world is changing, are we able to re-examine our own way of operating to take into consideration what you called identity politics has done, and think about reaching out to communities in Israel that are not necessarily the NIF community, folks like Shas and maybe Likud voters in the periphery? Is that a fair? Okay, great.
I'll take it.
I translated, and Mickey will answer.
First of all, actually, thank you so much for the question. I think it's probably the most important thing that one can do. We don't need to reflect too much on our faults because that's what the left usually does. We sit in a room and say how bad we've been for so many, and we have been. I'll tell you where I think that we strategically have made a mistake. And I, for many years, thought that if we build civil society for the sake of civil society, Israel will change. We supported hundreds of organizations, very specific organizations, very clear visions on education and Bedouin community and peace organizations. We never thought that our job is to be strategic, to think what's the objective we need to achieve and how we're going to achieve it. It means less organizations, it means much coordinated efforts, and it means know what you want to achieve. Not the notion that every individual will have its own voice in a kind of like multi-organization space that is very kind of like common in liberal spaces. And we were, bringing it in many ways from the United States, part of the problem in that matter.
Don't blame us.
It's an American approach. I mean, and I think that if you look at our programming today, definitely in the last 2 years, we're much more strategic, we're much more clear on the priorities. I said, democracy, peace and security, those are the spaces in which we are an Arab society within Israel, right? That's the spaces that we work on. Of course, it includes human rights and so on, but those are the spaces. How do we do it? Collaborative efforts that have very clear places. Now for your second question, I think that it's two-folded questions. First of all, I think that we have much better capacity to build our own space first before we go and reach out to other communities. I think that NIF has actually been very supportive of periphery communities. We've worked there for a very long time, people in poverty, people that are not necessarily progressive, and will continue to do so, right? But the notion that we first need to build our own camp is very clear today. That's one. The second thing, there are places that we need to be working on that are extremely important. And sorry if I'm getting too much into the weeds, but Rishon LeZion, Holon, Rehovot, the spaces around the center of Tel Aviv that were completely overlooked because civil society or philanthropy was either in the center or all the way to the periphery. Actually, the majority of Israelis live in this space, and this is a space that we have a very important role to play. And the last point I'll say, it's gaining power. The way that you influence Shas voters or Bibi voters and so on, if you know where you want to go, and you have the power to do so. Not as helping those who are not with you, but actually showing and projecting and allowing powerful vision, and that will actually get us to a much better place. Not the notion of we, the liberals, going all the way to the periphery, working with people who are not us. That has failed completely, including in our own strategy.
And we like your question because Mickey and I have led a strategic recalibration in the organization to focus on the three areas that he just named. And I want to be just as candid as you from the same spirit of love and partnership. You might not like the way we have done that because we really, I think what summed it up was what Mickey just said. We are not going to go to Holon and Rehovot and Rishon and say, let us help you, let us set up a clinic or a center. We're going to go and say, this is what you can get if you join with these Israelis for these goals. If you push back, you're being sold a bill of goods. And so we'll be very clear about what the objectives are, but we will not overlook communities, not to serve them, but to bring them into a democratic coalition.
More questions? Yes.
Thank you. I think you made an allusion to you could get to 51%. Let's assume that 20% of Israeli Arabs can be coalesced around some message that we would agree on. On what basis is your optimism that there are 30% more over the next year or 2 or 5 years amongst the Jews of Israel who can buy into this message that we may all agree on in this room, but I have a nasty feeling it's nothing like 30% at the moment?
I'll translate in case people didn't hear. Let's say you can get, and remember, we're a nonpartisan organization, so we're all sort of speculating now and thinking together. Let's say you can get to that, to mobilizing and that 20% of the Arab Israeli population takes its agency. Questioner asked, what gives us optimism that there's an additional 30% in Jewish Israel that would share the values? And I would say that for me, and I'll let you answer in more depth, that's why I answered your first question, not by saying how I felt from October 7th on till today, but how I felt from January of 23 on till today. Because in January 23, we saw something very, very surprising happen in Israel, and that was that somewhere around 70% of the country started to say, I identify with the Democratic camp in Israel. And that is a rich possibility for us. Now, Eran Halperin, who runs an organization he's a political psychologist doing research and data crunching, says, look, this is the first step. Israelis who consider themselves part of that camp now know what they're against. They're just not yet sure what they're for. And so the job of our brilliant grantees, and I say that seriously, like Ayala and her team at Molad, is to help shape the horizon and articulate what they're for, because they know what they don't want anymore.
Great, thank you. So great question, and I will just say as a Molad researcher that we have a lot of data showing that, and I would love to discuss it further. I know we have some time for drinks later on, but I see here, David wants to kill me. So thank you very much.
So first of all, a big thank you to Ayala, Mickey, and Daniel. Please, a round of applause. I hope many more of you have questions, and you're going to get to ask them in a slightly more, personal way to the three panelists outside. And there's at least, hopefully, if I finish quickly, another 25 minutes or so to grab a drink and have those conversations. I just wanted to say a few words. So first of all, it's actually a real honour for New Israel Fund in the UK to have both Daniel and Mickey visiting us at the same time. It's the second time since I've been in the role for 3 years that we've had the chance to do that. And I think you can see that we in the UK are part of a global family of people who are not giving up. And as you've probably heard, said a lot during the last years, despair is not a strategy. And we won't get everything right, but these guys are leading a strategy that is the best hope for the vision of Israel that I hope, wherever you sit, right, left, or centre, you believe in the idea of Israel as a safe homeland for the Jewish people, as a democratic state that treats everyone fairly, and as one that is aspiring to be at peace and live in security with its neighbours. They're not controversial things. They might sound controversial in certain places in Israel, but they're not controversial here. I also just want to point out that there were lots of good questions asked about the strategy and doing things differently and big, bold ideas, and Daniel and Mickey talked about a lot of that work. Quite a lot of it is summarised in this thing, so please take it away because you'll get a good idea of what we're doing. And I just want to end on one final thing, because last night Mickey talked a bit more about this and we didn't quite have the time to do it now. And it links to everything you've heard spoken about today, which is that in the weeks after October 7th, bizarrely to most of us, the Israeli government did not make the return of all of the hostages a priority in what they wanted to achieve. It wasn't even said as part of the war aims originally. And it was civil society and we kind of were a bit modest about it, but New Israel Fund and our organisations that said this has to be the number one priority. And when very quickly there was a forum set up, it's called the Hostages and Missing Families Forum, we were one of the first people they came to, and we were one of the first people to give them significant backing, financial, but also strategic and professional and emotional. And in recent weeks, when everyone thinks the deal's done and it's all over, and they're saying actually people aren't giving what they used to and people aren't coming forward, they've again turned to us, and I very much think that in the next few days we're going to again be the help for them to make sure that as many people can come back and, despite what we're going to have to see tomorrow, come back alive. And it's a combination of knowing what's right, doing what we can, and it's a combination of the leadership, but also, as you've seen, people on the streets every week demanding a better future for themselves. And as some of our grantees like to say, they all deserve better, and you can be part of giving them that better future. So thank you. Take your questions and yourselves outside, and you'll find them there.